post and all that stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I do not have a screen to share because there's simply no slides. I want this to be a conversation between us.
yeah, yeah.
So
No, no,
this will
no
not
problem.
entail
No,
any PowerPoint presentation or anything of that sort on my part.
yeah,
Perhaps so I should commence by thanking the Virtual Foreign Policy School and its director, Dr. Gore, for this invitation.
yeah, yeah.
And since we are in the late evening hours in India, of course, you'd be glad to note I do not have a PowerPoint and to inundate you with too many facts of a
Yeah,
learning nature at this point in time. Though I do
yeah,
hope it's an enjoyable and an informative session for you to
yeah,
take in what I can offer on, well, Iranian studies primarily, to which I approach because I am
yeah,
by training an Iranist.
yeah,
And in this context, and for our evening proceedings, Indo-Iranian relations with some aspect and accent devoted to Pakistan-Iran relations within the South Asian theme of things. So primarily, of course, our focus is on India, but given how Iran's relations have been with South Asia, inevitably a discussion of Pakistan will enter into the discourse, as you will find me referring to it so. It also happens to be that my work is not just as an Iranist on Iranian studies, but also Pakistan studies. I don't strictly speaking, do Indian studies per se, but I do Iranian and Pakistan and Central Asian studies. Uh, in the first instance, I would like to provide a historical overview of what were relations, Indo-Iranian relations, that is to say, imperial Iranian relations in the pre-79 era of the 20th century, starting with the onset of the Pahlavi dynasty, the last royal dynasty to rule Iran from 1925, when Reza Shah Pahlavi ascended the throne in a self-styled move as a Cossack officer and founded what became the Pahlavi dynasty. A decade later, he changed the name of the country from Persia to Iran by fiat and insisted the world start calling it Iran by its ancient name, that is Iran, which is, of course, synonymous with the word Aryan, as you know, which denotes hospitable and hospitality as such. Persia, of course, was a Latin word going back to the Greeks who called it Persis. And as you can tell, the connotation, it goes back to Pars province in south west Iran. And that's how you even get the term Parsis, referring to those Iranians who came to India's west coast Gujarat shores in the 9th and 10th century and made India its home. Which, of course, must remind you of the fact that the oldest Iranian diaspora in the world, the oldest continuing uh, operational diaspora in the world, are the Parsis of South Asia in India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka as a community. It is the oldest Iranian diaspora, but of course there have been Iranian contacts with Iran in the with India also right through the Indo-Persian period of what we call the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire, and of course coming down to the 1850s until the company control took over and the British Raj onset. You do know that Persian was the lingua franca of India and the various dynasties that ruled the subcontinent. And of course, Persian and Sanskrit were key languages, but of course, the tribal classes, including the Hindu Pandits, were conversant in Persian for keeping records. It wasn't just a language restricted to Muslim statesmen and scholars. Coming to the modern period, as I referred to, relations between British India and Iran were, of course, on an even keel, and Indian troops, Imperial Indian troops, were stationed in Iran during the war, the last war, when Iran in 1941 was occupied and divided into two zones, northern Iran under the Russians and southern Iran under the British. The reason for that was the deposition of the Shah that I just mentioned to you, Reza Shah Pahlavi, the first Shah who founded this dynasty, given his pro-Axis sympathies. And he had a sympathetic hearing among the Nazis in Berlin too. And of course, the Allies were worried that Iran could fall into the Nazis' lap. There was every possibility of that happening so, and to say nothing of the world's largest oil refinery at that time at Abadan, which is near the coast with Iran. And of course, which came into focus, as you know, and we will talk about later in the 1980 to 88 Iran-Iraq war. But it is interesting to note, Dr. Gore, that as old timers, even in England, mentioned to me that not once did the Nazis ever bomb Abadan. They bombed Cairo, as you know. And Rommel was out in the Western Desert, Field Marshal Rommel. But they never bombed Abadan because they had every intention of taking over intact, like a plum falling into its lap. And of course, if the road from Iran had opened up, which it would have had the Allies fallen, and if Cairo had fallen, of course, to Rommel, as you know, the Nazis would have been at the gateway of India in Bombay within 3 weeks' time by shipping lines. It was a given, to say nothing of Japan operations in Kohima and Burma that India was also combating on the Eastern Front. So it was necessary to occupy Iran. Come the end of the war, the British left Iran promptly after cessation of hostilities in May 1945. Stalin in northern Iran continued and refused to budge, which tells you something about the Soviet Union and its policies and what happened across as the Iron Curtain, which Churchill said was to descend across Europe, as some of your students would know from a history of the Cold War. Because in northern Iran, in the Kurdish areas, Stalin set up a puppet state of revolutionary workers and in what is Iranian Azerbaijan. Very briefly, there is Soviet Azerbaijan, as you know, which existed until 1991, following which it became an independent republic known as Azerbaijan today, which is, of course, locked in conflict with Armenia, as you know. But there is also something called Iranian Azerbaijan within Iran, just as there is West Bengal on this side of the border and East Bengal, which became Bangladesh, but that is historically speaking a Bengal-speaking zone. There is an Azeri-speaking zone within the Iranian borders too. And that province also is where Stalin installed a puppet regime. Until November 1946, it was known as the Mahalabad Crisis. And finally, the Allies prevailed at the United Nations that Stalin had to evacuate. Those provinces were returned to Imperial Iran. By this time, Iran had a new Shah, the deposed Shah's young son, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, and the Soviets were ejected. It was the first flashpoint of the Cold War. And ever since then, of course, Iran drew closer into the Western satellite of Western camp of allies, particularly after the 1953 oil crisis, as you know, which was the coup and Mohammad Mossadegh was ousted. And the National Iranian Oil Company was set up with a Western consortia of leading oil firms. So that brings us to the 50s. And of course, speaking of the 50s, India and Iran established diplomatic relations on 15th March 1950. Please remember that until the morning of 14th August 1947 and transfer of power took place, India had a contiguous border with Iran, a 560-kilometer border between British India, which ended at the west point with Balochistan, and where Iran began as such. So it's interesting to bear that in mind that Iran and India were neighbors until, of course, the Dominion of Pakistan came into existence on the morning of 14th August. Iran was the first country in the world to recognize Pakistan's existence, diplomatically speaking, and relations were established between Karachi and Tehran in March 1948. I say Karachi because that was the capital until 1960, when a new dedicated capital and artificial city was constructed, as you know, in Islamabad. Karachi was the capital from 47 to 60. And the relations started off well with both republics, Imperial Iran's, Pahlavi Iran's relations. Nehru made a visit in 1959 to Tehran, but prior to that, the Shah had come on a very important state visit in 1956 to Bombay, New Delhi, and elsewhere. The Shah had also made an important visit to Pakistan prior to that, itself in February 1950 on a 12-day tour of what was West Pakistan, that is today's Pakistan, and as you know, something called East Pakistan, today's Bangladesh. An important memorandum, treaty of friendship and cooperation was signed, Indo-Iranian treaty was signed on the Shah's visit. The Shah made several other visits too, particularly in 74 and the last visit in 78, February 78. Those other visits were under Congress dispensations, as you can tell, and the one in February 78 under the Desai administration, that was the first non-Congress Janta government. There are 3-4 takeaways here during the Shah's period, which are important to touch upon, although it may seem like past history, Dr. Gore, for your students. Iran supported Pakistan during both wars, 1965 and 1971. The Muslim sentiment aspect is but obvious, given civilization links with Pakistan and Iran, which of course also existed with India too, as I mentioned in certain factors. But it goes without saying that sentimentalism, a sense of Muslim cohesion as an organic community and a sense of belonging to the Ummah, a corporate sense of identity, always informs Muslim politics. And Iran did support Pakistan in the September 65 operations. In fact, in an official communique, despite Ayub Khan's incursions into Kashmir and, as you know, on the Rann of Kutch border, Tehran put it out that it was Indian aggression which commenced hostilities, which is not true. But of course, India let that go as such. And Iran, in both instances, 65 and 71, provided equipment to Pakistan, material and support, which of course does make sense because remember, after 1954, Pakistan signed a defense treaty with the United States. And in 55, Dr. Gore, Pakistan joined the Baghdad Pact, CENTO, of which Iran was a member too. So it is natural that Pakistan and Iran became Cold War allies, ostensibly supporting each other in this anti-communism pact along Russia's southern tier, the Soviet Central Republics. We are still in the Cold War period, as you can tell. And like I said, Iran supported equipment and training and personnel to Pakistan in 65, but particularly during the 71 operations too, when the Nixon administration officially took a neutral stance. It was later discovered, Dr. Gore, that the Shah had funneled additional equipment and support, fighter jets, spare parts and the like, and the Nixon administration did that through Jordan and Turkey, alongside the Shah, to Iran. To keep up a public appearance of neutrality, of course, the Nixon administration could not, despite the famous or rather infamous tilt towards Yahya Khan. But what happened after 71 is interesting. And a credit to the Shah, Dr. Gore, is that he realized, and we do now know from Iran-Pakistan records on which I work more than the Indian aspect, as I mentioned, the Shah realized that Pakistan was a loose cannon and that it could not be trusted. His first inkling was there after the 65 war, but after 71, he was fully convinced, with the dismemberment of the state and Bangladesh coming into existence, that Pakistan was a loose cannon. It was an irresponsible element in the region, and that at best, Iran should be coaxing and cajoling Pakistan along the way to maintain a moderate stance in matters and to see to it that its own eastern front is not disturbed, given that its northern front it shared with the Soviet Union and it didn't want communist incursions and the like. And the Persian, the Persian Gulf was what the Shah considered his sphere of influence, and the Indian Ocean region, as you know. But the Shah had come to the conclusion that Pakistan needed to be kept on an even keel, but he could not trust them entirely anymore. And there was relations with Bhutto right through the 70s until Bhutto's ousting in 77 remained cordial at best. One exception to it is this. Pakistan had an insurgency, quasi-Marxist insurgency in its Balochistan province from the mid-70s, as you know. And Bhutto was out to quash that, as he put it, to force them not to, quote, do another Bengal, which would have led to a further vivisection of Pakistan, as you know. And the Shah directly supported the Bhutto administration because Bhutto had made a state visit to Tehran, Dr. Kaur. And following that visit, he took it as a green signal that he could go out and decimate the Baloch rebels, Gauss, Baks, Bisenjo, Ataullah, Mengal factions, the Mengals and Bisenjos, as you know. And of course, the Shah provided Apache helicopters and full-fledged equipment from the Imperial Iranian Air Force to do just that. And you may say, why is that so if the Shah had mixed feelings of Bhutto and Pakistan by then? For the simple reason that Iran has within its borders something called Balochistan. Again, just like there's West Bengal and East Bengal, there is a Balochistan province in Pakistan, ladies and gentlemen, but there is also something called Sistan va Baluchistan, a province among Iran's 31 provinces. It is Iran's largest province. It is also Iran's only predominantly Sunni province in what is otherwise a Shia dispensation and a Shia country, ever since Iran became Shiaized in 1501 after the Safavid dynasty. Iran was a Sunni country prior to that, with the onset of Islam and the collapse of the Zoroastrian Sasanian Empire. But from 1501, Iran became officially a Shia polity. And every Shia dynasty has ruled Iran since 1501. And now, of course, it's a full-fledged Shia republic after the 1979 revolution. So so the Shah naturally wanted to see that he would not have his Sunni Baloch minority create problems for him. And so he naturally was inclined to support Bhutto to see that the Balochis wouldn't gang up and create a new independent Balochistan by parceling themselves out of both Iran and Pakistan as a state. And of course, after 2002, you know, the Baloch insurgency again flared up under Musharraf and the murder of the Sardar as such. And it has been a festering low-level conflict. In that 70s period that I just referred to, it was a Marxist insurgency. It had quasi-Marxist leftist guerrilla overtones. Now, of course, since post-2002, the Baloch conflict in Pakistan has a purely nationalist ethno-linguistic element to it based on dissatisfaction. We'll talk about that subsequently also, given how things are panning out in Iran currently, because Zahidar and Balochistan is in the news. So that brings me to the 70s. And 2 or 3 salient takeaways of the Indo-Iran relationship are these, Dr. Gore, which your students might note. Again, it's history, but please indulge me as a historian. I prefer the past more so than the present, but of course I will talk about the present to you too. A flagship project in the last decade of the Shah, which would have happened, Dr. Gore, in November 1975, was known as the Kudremukh Iron Ore Project in Karnataka. That was signed between India and Iran. And it was a model project in every sense of the term, because it involved that vast deposits of iron ore were there in this part of Karnataka that I referred to, that when extracted was the quality of iron that could not be used in India's predominantly coal blast furnaces. But guess what? It was aptly suited for export to Iranian steel mills. And technical collaboration took place between India and Iran on these matters, study projects, and it was discovered that India would export this to Iran. Pahlavi Iran and the Shah put in a contract of the project and underwrote the project with soft loans to the tune of $630 million. And this is 1975, so you can imagine it's quite an appreciable amount. Plus, Iran undertook, Dr. Gore, the construction of a new port, storage facilities, and ancillary support at New Mangalore port. Iran built what is today's New Mangalore port, incidentally. And everything was on track for the export of this iron, which would be extracted, shipped out to Bandar Abbas, to Iran, southern Iran, for Iran's steel mills, who could deal with the kind of quality of the iron chemically that was found in India that could not be refined in India, but could very aptly be done in Iran. So it was a complete win-win situation. But as you can tell, the first consignment that was due to be dispatched was in September 1980, by which time, of course, Iran was plunged into revolution. The Shah had left. In fact, the Shah departed for his exile in January 79. And by June 1980, he was dead in Cairo, as you know, from cancer. But that was the Kudremukh Iron Ore project, which never really took off, but which was signed. Despite the wars that I mentioned about 65 and 71, Iran never interrupted its oil supplies to Iran during those periods of crisis. Although it kept up its sentimental and vocal support for Pakistan, it was tactful enough not to disrupt oil supplies to India and to keep relations with India on a cordial diplomatic balance as such. It did not want to obviously aggravate India too. I mean, this was Iran playing off its sense of strategic autonomy, put it that way, as India tends to do so too. Besides the Kudremukh project that I mentioned, there was another project with the Indira Gandhi administration in 1975, the Irano-Hind shipping lines that was started with the Shipping Corporation of India. that functioned right up to the very recent, until sanctions really hit, which of course have an adverse effect on Indian exporters and Indian trade. And so India, for its part, decided to wind down the company. But this was a joint venture shipping line. And of course, going back to 1965, Dr. Gore, Madras refineries, where it was set up in 1965, was in collaboration with the government of India, and it still is 15%. I believe now it's 17 or something, a bit along those lines, percent of which is still owned by NIOC, National Iranian Oil Company. So these were, I just wanted to point out 3 big projects, and the Shah was very keen on every visit to seek technical collaboration with India and the economic side of things. In just after the Pokhran blasts in 1974, the Indian explosions in Rajasthan, the Shah sought out Indian technical help with the Atomic Energy Commission, because the Shah was already building his nuclear plant in Bushehr in southern Iran, and he did seek Indian collaboration on this. There was also talk after the revolution for India supplying a 10 megawatt reactor, 100 megawatt reactor in 1991, but that did not come to pass under US pressure too. That's something to note. The revolution occurred the revolutionary period started from January 78, opposition to the Shah, until, as I mentioned, his departure from Tehran in Jan 79. It was a year-long revolution. Jimmy Carter spent New Year's Eve 1977, 31st December 77, dining with the Shah. 1st January 78, he flew out to New Delhi to begin his state visit to India. And, well, it's important to mention that he arrived from Tehran. And 8 days later, the first demonstration started with in Iran against Khomeini, with broadcasts and some slanderous articles against him in the newspaper. And that continued right through on. Foreign Minister Vajpayee, and yes, he was foreign minister in 1978. Dr. Gore is old enough to remember that, I'm sure, if not some of your students, made a visit to the Shah in May 78. That, Dr. Gore, was the last official visit between the Indian Republic and Pahlavi Iran. And on that visit, of course, the Shah sought Foreign Minister Vajpayee and New Delhi's assurance of how things were panning out in Afghanistan. If you remember, after the April Revolution, the Marxist Revolution, Saur Revolution under Taraki, and that to join Iran and Pakistan in keeping Afghanistan on an even keel, lest the Soviets move in. And remember, this is still May 78 I'm referring to. The Soviets went in December 79, Christmas Day, as you know. But Vajpayee would not be drawn into it and remained non-committal. In June 78, Prime Minister Desai flew to Heathrow, London, for a official visit to Prime Minister Callaghan, his British counterpart. But it's interesting, ladies and gentlemen, that Desai did not fly Delhi to Heathrow, but took a pit stop in Tehran, a fuel stop, just to see the Shah for a few hours. I mean, you can make much of it. It was symbolic as such, but that was the last visit between official contact, point of contact between the Indian Republic and Pahlavi Iran, June 78. And the Shah broke protocol, incidentally, to meet Prime Minister Desai at Tehran airport by arriving just to see him for a few hours off the aircraft. The Shah, as you know, had made a state visit, which was his last state visit in February 78 with Empress Farah. So that brings us to the revolution, Jan 79. And of course, India cautiously welcomed it, as did Pakistan, because both countries didn't know what to expect with an unknown quantity like Khomeini and radicalism, and as Iran plunged into civil war conditions. And those conditions continued and were to continue for a while, until the regime consolidated itself. It officially became an Islamic Republic in April 79, after a so-called plebiscite, where 99.9% population voted. And of course, everything changed. It was a complete game changer when Saddam Hussein invaded on 22nd September 1980, starting one of the bloodiest conflicts of the 20th century, the 8-year Iran-Iraq War, until July 1988. Some of us are old enough to remember it, at least I was during my school days, so it was quite something during our times. And Dr. Gore, of course, would also recollect aspects of it. Throughout this period that I'm referring to, the 80s, Indo-Iran diplomatic relations continued. It's interesting to note that Pakistan once again could use its geostrategic location as it always has done during the Cold War period and even after. Right now, as you can tell, through transit facilities to Afghanistan for the Allies after 9/11. Uh, Through the Iran-Iraq War, Dr. Gore, Karachi was opened up by General Zia as a port for transporting foodstuffs and across overland through Pakistan's Balochistan into Iran, Balochistan, and across into Iran. And it was Iran's lifeline. It was a very brilliant tactical move by Zia. At the same time, of course, he was cajoling Iran, with whom he had no love lost, as a radical Shia neighbor, despite under pressure from his Sunni traditional Arab allies, notably the UAE and Saudi Arabia, to go hard on Iran, which he did not. So Pakistan was here trying to please everyone too, which it tends to do. But it's interesting to note that it managed to balance its relations between the Arab Sunni sheikdoms and a radical Shia revolutionary regime on its border. Not to mention Pakistan's own quite voluble Shia minority too. To say nothing of the ethnic sectarian strifes that started occurring right from the late 70s on Zia's watch as Chief Martial Law Administrator, and which had an impact on the ethnic fabric of Pakistan and still does so till today, as you know. One reason why Zia gave the green light to Sunni jihadist outfits like the Sipahi Sahaba Pakistan and others is to even out the balance playing field against the Shia Tehreek-e-Jafariya sort of outfits so that they don't have the upper hand, and that of course the military can manage what is known as organized chaos in Pakistan and keep everyone in control because they are the only last resort of law and order, the usual playbook, as you know. And Iran did play a debilitating role by fomenting riots in Karachi. And we talk about the so-called Kalashnikov culture, Dr. Gore, after the Afghan onset of the Afghan occupation by the Soviets. But this was even prior to December 79. And Zia came into office in July 77 after ousting Bhutto, when ethnic riots broke down across Pakistan. And after 79 and the revolution, Iran did stoke up a lot of these problems for Pakistan, it must be noted. Not so much for India. And Iran has always privately been grateful that a secular Indian dispensation has been home to, well, what is the second largest Shia population in the world. Tehran does factor that in, ladies and gentlemen. Please note, it may have problems with India, and it does, which I'll talk about, but Tehran has always factored in that the world's second largest agglomeration of Shia live quite peacefully in a secular, non-confessional republic where they're treated with equity and by a non-partisan administration, the New Delhi administration. It has never been lost on them. And in fact, when President Rafsanjani came in an April 1995 visit to New Delhi, which was marked quite a successful visit by both sides in foreign policy circles. Rafsanjani also visited Lucknow to a Shia religious center, and Lucknow is traditionally speaking a 12 Shia center in the subcontinent and has been for centuries, going back to the kingdom of Oud days, as you know. And there, Rafsanjani, who is a Shia cleric or was a Shia cleric, he's dead now, by profession and vocation. It's interesting, a man coming from an Islamic theocracy, standing up in a public forum and praising a country which is ostensibly irreligious or secular by praising India's secular fabric, which is quite a statement to make, which he did. That visit, where Prime Minister Rao was his host, was, as I mentioned, considered a resounding success in both Indian and Iranian foreign policy circles, and is still spoken of today. Prime Minister Rao visited Iran in September 1993. That was the first official visit by the Indian Republic to the post-79 Iranian dispensation, the Islamic Republic of Iran. Nothing between Desai's pit stop flying visit in June 78 to September 93 took place. There were ministerial visits. Foreign Minister Velayati did arrive here in September 83 for the Non-Aligned Movement Summit, the 7th NAM Summit, Vigyan Bhavan, New Delhi, where Mrs. Gandhi played host, her last final year in office, September 83. Iran participated in the 1982 Asiad Games too, as you know. And incidentally, Iran hosted the 1974 Asian Games too. That was the first time in the Middle East the Games were ever held under the Shah. And so, yeah, that takes us to the 90s. And in that 1995 visit of Rafsanjani, he was questioned about Kashmir, and he quite politely struck down that reporter. I believe it was a Pakistani reporter, and he avoided the question, and he said, no, we're not. He refused to be drawn into it. And that went down well with the Indians too, as you can imagine. Though, of course, after the December 1992 mosque incident in Ayodhya, the Iranian Foreign Office was quite vocal about India, and it did make noises about it quite publicly, stating that this is unacceptable and the like. But of course, subsequently, Iran tempered its voice by saying that this was not an action undertaken by the Indian government, but by select forces of extra elements, extra state actors as such. But that reminds me that Iran has not been averse every so now and often to talk about Kashmir or the Muslim factor. Although, like I said, it does talk about praising India's secularism. With the onset of the insurgency in Kashmir in the 1990s under the VP Singh administration too, Iran did make public noises about it. And that Kashmir is being drawn, Kashmiris are paying in fire and blood, which is quite a strong statement from the Iran Foreign Office to make. But the Indians just merely noted it and didn't make a fuss about it. And why do you say that? Because Indo-Iran relations, despite their ups and downs, which I shall come to shortly, have always decided to have things done in closed-door sessions so that there are no public spats, and to keep a positive front for, well, public consumption as such. So that was Indo-Iran relations up to the Rafsanjani visit. Then we come to 2001, and now he becomes prime minister, not foreign minister as he was in 78. Vajpayee makes an important visit, and the Tehran Declaration is signed with Iran, which were important MOUs were undertaken for the first time with the new Islamic regime. Well, new in the sense it was already there since 1979. And the visit was, of course, went down well. That visit, following which 9/11 took place, of course, saw a joint working group of terrorism, counterterrorism and narcotics set up for intelligence sharing and concerns about Afghanistan in place too. That's one point of convergence between Tehran and New Delhi, though there have been other points of friction which we will discuss. Stability in Afghanistan. That Iran does not want a loose cannon militant Sunni on its eastern front merits no reiteration. The Taliban is dead set against a Shia dispensation like Iran, who they consider heretics, if not incomplete Muslims, even at the best of times. And if you think the Taliban is bad, you can just imagine what the Islamic State Khorasan force thinks of Shias as such. And quite rightly, they just want Shias dead, and they're more than happy to indulge in bloodletting of the Shia. It just helps Iran to have a breather currently that the IS Khorasan is pitted against the Taliban, whom they have no love lost with, and with the Al-Qaeda. So we have a three-way bloodbath played out in Afghanistan. And of course, incidentally, the IS Khorasan may be Sunnis, which they are hardcore Sunnis, but have no love lost for Pakistan too, and are dead set against the state of Pakistan. But that's another kettle of fish. In August 98, ladies and gentlemen, 24 hours after the US embassy attacks in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, 7th August 98 to be precise, on 8th August 98, Dr. Gore, the Iranian consulate in Mazar-e-Sharif, Balkh province, ancient Bactria of the Kushans under Kanishka, if you remember, was attacked. The Taliban just walked into the consulate, literally walked in, and casually aimed fire aimed at 8 sitting Iranian diplomats on their desks and shot them to death, and casually again walked out and went across the rampage across the city of the town of Mazar-e-Sharif, killing as many Shia as they possibly could. That, of course, this was a shocker for Iran is needless to state there. And 24 years on, Iran still has been asking the new Taliban government for answers to what happened that day. There are live recordings of it, and I did see a BBC documentary some years ago, Dr. Gore. It was pretty chilling to hear when the hotline from the Mazar-e-Sharif consulate to the Tehran Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as the guy was saying in Persian, "We are going down, we are going down," and then the line got cut off, and we could hear shots in the background. 2 takeaways from that. for the first time, Iran publicly condemned Pakistan, holding them responsible as side by the Taliban for siding the Taliban. And the Khatami administration, President Khatami, openly implicated Pakistan responsible for the death of Iranian diplomats and an Iranian journalist who was killed that day. And not only that, a 70,000 strong Iranian army force was on the border to go in for a cross-border operation too. But at the last minute, Khatami decided to hold fire, and they decided not to do so in order to not flare up a situation. But the Iranians have not forgotten that. That is my point, which I wish to impart in this discourse to you. You do know in 2016, the Mazar-e-Sharif Indian consulate was also attacked, and a 24-hour gun ordeal occurred. But that's on the sidelines. But just to mention that Mazar-e-Sharif tends to be a strategic location as such. So following that, and since I mentioned President Khatami, he arrived in January 2003 as the Republic Day chief guest, which, as you know, India tends to do every year for a foreign visitor. And it's considered the highest official honor bestowed by the Indian Republic to visiting dignitaries, to have them as a guest for its Republic Day festivities. So President Khatami arrived, and that visit was even on a greater resounding success than Vajpayee's 2001 Tehran visit, because a new roadmap was declared, and now Indo-Iranian strategic partnership was declared, and 7 to 8 MOUs were signed on this particular visit. Of course, talking about the civilizational links, but also coming to the modern factor of modern aspect of energy security, hydrocarbon supplies, and a technical collaboration which the Iranians desperately need. I mean, it is much of a pariah country after 1979, cut off from the global economic system, and it desperately needs hardware, and not just for its defense and ammunition upkeep and maintenance, but also inputs into its industry, and not just heavy industries, but also soft industries, services industries, cyber services, backrooms outsourcing, and the like, software at which India is very adept. And the Iranians have been very keen to push for that. Of course, the Iranians have been very keen to get India into the nuclear sphere of things too. By the by, in the mid-80s, Rafsanjani offered General Zia, Dr. Gore, $1 million flat, take it, no questions asked, just give us a nuclear design blueprint. Because that was the acute part of the war when there was threat that Saddam could nuke Iran. And the Iranians were fighting with their back to the wall since they had no supplies, since they were cut off from the Americans, as you know. All their equipment was there from the Shah's days, which they were rapidly depleting. And Saddam had used gas biological attacks on his own Kurdish citizens, but there was every chance that he would do so and chemically spray Iranians to death too. It was a very palpable fear, and the Iranians felt the asymmetry was extremely glaring that they had to gulf, and they were desperate to get nuclear weapons. But of course, Zia vacillated and kept stringing them along and did not really do much about it. What he did do, and this is what we know when the sanctions were happen later, I should come to it later, but I'll just mention it since I'm talking about it now, is that Islamabad shared P5 centrifuge drawings with Tehran, which Iran was forced to admit after 2006 when the sanctions and discussions at the Security Council started. So they did do that. It's not that the Pakistanis were all that good and diplomatic about it. So that brings me to the Khatami administration that I just mentioned to you just now. Right. That brings us then into the phase of Indo-Iranian ties, which are not just based on, like I said, oil and gas, because until recently with the Ukraine conflict, as you know, Iran was, at least until this year with the starting the onset of the February 24th Ukraine conflict, Iran was India's second largest supplier of oil, crude oil. Iran is, by the way, China's largest supplier, incidentally, and India's second largest supplier. Today, as we speak, as I conduct this seminar, Russia has overtaken everyone, as you know, with discounted oil supplies. So Russia and Iraq are principal suppliers to India, but earlier and for a very long time, it was traditionally Saudi Arabia and Iran. So obviously, India has much to keep that relationship with Iran going, despite pressure from the West, particularly the United States. Indo-Iranian joint naval exercises have occurred since 2003. Indian ships have berthed at Persian Gulf ports, notably Bandar Abbas. And this brings me to what is an important point is the collaboration, the defense collaboration that has taken place so far has been primarily between the Indian Navy and the Islamic Republic's Navy. Iranian naval technicians have been trained at Vizag, Cochin, and as well as Mazgon Docks, Bombay. And at the last facility, Mazgon in Bombay, Dr. Kaur, Iranian submarines have berthed too, because they are Russian, the K-class, Akula-class subs as such. You know the technical specifications, that's public knowledge. But India was asked or requested by Tehran to tropicalize the batteries, which of course are more suited to an Arctic, temperate continental climate, the batteries in question, because India has the near similar equipment. And so the batteries had to be tropicalized for, well, tropical waters like India and the Persian Gulf. So India did undertake that for the Iranian Navy, as well as midlife maintenance and upgrading of the subs. Indian Navy has done that. The Indian Navy has also trained technicians of the Iranian Navy. And there have been visits undertaken at high levels between the Iranian and Indian admirals between both capitals. What is interesting is this, and here we come into now the modern period. You see, on all three counts, Dr. Gore, India voted to sanction Iran after discovery was made that Iran is undertaking nuclear development at the surreptitious facility underground in Natanz, central Iran, which an Iranian opposition group broke to the first to the world, that this was happening, that the Iranians were doing it. Resolutions were passed on the General Assembly floor in New York in 2005, 2006, and 2009. In all three instances, Iran voted with America and the Western world. Naturally, that led to India drawing a lot of flack with its own leftist domestic constituents at home, that India ought to be non-aligned, should not be a Western stooge of imperialism and the like, and should support Iran, and that Iran has every right to pursue a nuclear policy howsoever it sees fit. But India was vindicated in voting against Iran, and I would like to delve for a few minutes on that. The Indian contention was this, and please remember that India was in a very sticky position because we are talking about 2005 now. We are now in the period, ladies and gentlemen, where the first stirrings and talks were happening of that landmark Indo-US civilian nuclear deal, the 123 agreement, which came to pass eventually in 2008, but discussions started from 2005 and given a full impetus after Prime Minister Singh's visit to Washington. But prior to that, President Bush Jr.'s visit to New Delhi in March 2006. And that brings me to this. In the first round of voting in 2005, India voted against Tehran, declaring with the rest of the global community that Iran should make a clean breast of what it has been undertaking so far. And that's when the Iranians grudgingly admitted that we have received drawings, the P5 centrifuge drawings from Islamabad, not to mention other inputs from, you guessed, Pyongyang of all places. North Korea and Pakistan have helped Iran. And that, Dr. Gore, is what Foreign Secretary Shyam Saran mentioned after the 2006 vote, that there is every credible reason for India to pursue this course of action because what has been shared by Pyongyang and Islamabad does have ramifications for Indian security, not just national, but regional security. So Iran must make a quote unquote, I have Shyam Saran's communique, full accounting of what it had obtained in the years previous as such. There's no letting up on that. So it was in India's interest to vote with the US on it. And also India's position was that on a legal aspect was this. India is a non-signatory to the NPT protocol since it was instituted in 1968. And after 1974 too, India never signed it, as you know, the Pokhran explosion, Pokhran 1. But even in 68, when the treaty was promulgated, India refused to sign it because it believed this would go against its national interests. So India stood transparently stating we've never been an NPT member, so there's no question of hypocrisy or skullduggery on our part. Pahlavi Iran under the Shah had signed the NPT in 1968, and it was ratified in 1970 by the global community. Now, until 2005, when all these problems occurred and the can of worms erupted, Iran was a signatory to the NPT, and it was committed to nuclear non-proliferation. But now going ahead and, with fissile material development, uranium enrichment, and the like. So that means clearly it was a hypocrite. It was saying one thing and it was doing something quite else. If Iran had removed itself from the NPT anytime after 1979 when the government changed, that's another matter. But it has not removed it remained even after 79 and the political climate changed from a royalist to a Republican administration. So India's position was that Iran is guilty in that you say one thing and you do quite another. If you had left the NPT, that is another matter. But you have signed the NPT and you are in violation of it. So India took a very correct, almost legal, very literal, formal stance on the matter to give itself a breather, obviously, because it had to balance its relations between India and between Iran and the US. And that brings me, as I said, to 2005 and this 2006 period with considerable pressure, including Ambassador David Mulford, who was in New Delhi at this time, Dr. Gore, who said that much progress on this civilian nuclear deal, which was being conducted between Nicholas Burns at the State Department and a certain S. Jaishankar at the Foreign Office, Indian Foreign Office, as you know. He wasn't Foreign Secretary that time, but quite a senior diplomat. But both of them were on the drawing board with this to get this treaty going, which eventually came to pass. And the Americans made it pretty clear that you will have to wean yourself away from Iran. Weaning away itself means, voting on this aspect. So India did vote against Iran on all three occasions. And the final 2009 vote, when Iran was referred to the Security Council, the sanctions were placed on it after 2009. But also that not just the voting thing, but also to cut down your hydrocarbon imports. Buy more oil and gas from Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, who are more than happy to fill in the gap if you were to wean yourself away from Tehran supplies, which India has done too. These actions on India's part have not gone unnoticed or led to reciprocity on Tehran's part, needless to state. So what happened? Iran expressed its displeasure. I believe the Petroleum Secretary at some point during the Congress administration, Dr. Gore, was a certain M.S. Iyer, Mr. Manishankar Iyer, who had also served as India's Deputy High Commissioner to Pakistan when there was an Indian consulate running at Karachi. It's closed down now for several decades. At that visit, Mr. Iyer had signed a 25-year liquid natural gas agreement, uninterrupted supplies to India. The Iranians reneged on that deal by claiming we have to renegotiate and oil prices and gas prices have gone up. That can't be right, and this, that, and the other. So whatever we signed, we are going to pull the rug under your feet, and well, you can tell what that rest of that means. So that didn't quite come through. And the question of liquid natural gas refining doesn't even arise. There was the part of the agreement involved refining LNG in Iran, which simply can't exist because Iran has raw gas supplies. But Iran, despite being a global gas provider and supplier, has no LNG facility for refining. It never has had in all these years for the last half century, despite being a major hydrocarbon exporter, because it never developed the gas industry. And now, even if it wanted to, you could never do that because of sanctions, since certain parts are indispensable, which can only be obtained if you were to waiver US sanctions, and that was not going to happen anytime soon. And all three, Bharat Petroleum, Hindustan Petroleum, and Indian Oil, and ONGC have found themselves at all times under the Commerce Department's scanner, that you can't exceed investments more than $20 million. There are 180-day renewals and re-inspections of every transaction undertaken by these Indian public sector units for transactions with Iran. And it comes under not just these nuclear sanctions after 2009, but also the Iran-Libya sanctions, a previous set of sanctions that were imposed by Washington. So all three have been very, very wary, to say nothing of other Indian importers and exporters too, as to how does one do business. And at some point, the Indians have realized that the benefits do not outweigh doing business with Iran and invoking the ire of the Americans and these sanctions. The Americans have been accommodating nevertheless. The Chabahar port facility, which was constructed after the 2003 New Delhi Declaration with Kadami's landmark visit that I mentioned, India undertook the construction of the Chabahar port in Iran's Balochistan province, which is 72 kilometers away from Pakistan's Balochistan Gwadar port. Now, of course, as part of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, the Belt and Road Investment, as you know. And it just gives you a sense, if you can picture 72 kilometers is not much. I mean, Bombay to Pune is 192 kilometers. So the border is pretty proximate. You have a Gwadar port, but you also have the Chabahar. So the Chinese, of course, can claim Gwadar, but India also has a plum in its lap with the Chabahar port. India was to undertake the equipping and modernizing of the port in question, which it did. And it was formally inaugurated under Prime Minister Modi's May 2016 visit, as you know. But not much has come of it. In 2019, for example, the port still remained underutilized. Only 10% utilization was reported in 2019. And it's a port with about a good 86 berths. So it's not much of a success story in that sense. Where it has had symbolic success, Dr. Gore, is in this aspect, that sometime in 2017, the first shipments of wheat were dispatched from New Bombay, Vashi, to Chabahar. And that was then transported overland to Afghanistan. And so, as you can tell, that was to avoid the Pakistan land corridor, through which, of course, India has no access and never has had, which tells us why, of course, Iran is important too, the connectivity part in the Indo-Iran relations chessboard. That is, India had committed not just to constructing the Chabahar port and maintaining it, but also the subsequent ring road between Delaram and Zaranj, from Iran's Balochistan Zaranj to Delaran in Nimroz province of southwest Afghanistan, which the BRO, Border Roads Organization, was to undertake, a 215-kilometer stretch. But that has run into problems with sanctions. And then, of course, with Chabahar, the Americans did give India a waiver on Chabahar, to be fair to the Americans and to their credit. And even when Trump snapped back sanctions, as you know, the second, went back on the JCPOA July 2015 agreement. The sanctions which were put back on Tehran, as you know, India sought a waiver for Chabahar, and it did get a waiver. But you see, again, the conundrum is this, that you can't invest and cross more than, I think, $20 million and that sort of thing, and that would kick in. So you may have a waiver, which is a breather, something of a lifeline, but that won't help much. So the situation has been like that since August 2018, when Trump reimposed sanctions on Iran. And of course, like I said, the Iranians, that didn't go unnoticed. ONGC Videsh, which is a consortium, which is a subsidiary of Oil and Natural Gas Commission of India, ONGC, discovered the Farzad oil field in the Persian Gulf. And the Indians were pretty sure that they would back the contract for it, along with the South Pars oil field. And at the last minute, of course, Iranians said no. It was informally agreed, I believe, not quite formally, but then the Iranians did not give, I believe the Chinese got the contract eventually. So that tells you how Iran also has done tit for tat payback on these aspects. But it's interesting that India still tends to flex itself. 2 points on this aspect, Dr. Gore. Um, I mentioned about President Bush's March 2006 visit to New Delhi, and much of it was concentrating on the civilian nuclear deal agreement. That was the basic thing that was being discussed among a host of other factors. But in February 2006, a month earlier, India and Iran conducted naval exercises in the Arabian Sea. Now, as I mentioned, these exercises have been going on since 2003. But what was important is the symbolism of it, that it came so close on the heels of President Bush's visit, and many would have thought it would have been embarrassing to the Americans to whom you are about to play a guest to do something like that. But of course, the Indians were out there to show that they have a sense of strategic autonomy and can dictate their own foreign policy. That yes, we are going to discuss with the Americans next month about the nuclear deal, but that doesn't impinge upon our relationship with Tehran, whom we have a working relationship, and we will go ahead with our naval exercises. This did not go down well on the Hill in Washington, and certain US senators were furious about it, that the president's about to embark on a South Asian tour, because Bush Jr. also visited Pakistan and Afghanistan on that visit. And we are about to get into a historic agreement with India, which is a complete one-off, by violating the traditional NPT treaty by having a full-fledged civilian nuclear deal with a non-NPT member, which is unheard of, historically speaking, and has never really been done. But that has happened, as you know now, and a singular exception was made of India for this. So the Americans felt that we were backflipping to accommodate India, and it seemed a not poor but almost tactless taste on your part to have naval exercises with such a regional problematic partner, which has created problems for America and its allies in the Middle East, and still continues to do so. So that didn't go down well, but I just thought I'd mention that. But there were US senators, the pro-India lobby, who tried to mollify their other senators and others who were asking such questions. And they said, no, it's just a working visit by the Iranian Navy. There was not much of it, so let's not go to town about it. And they tried to play it down. But it just goes to show that the Americans went out of their way even to lie about it and say, no, it was just a working visit. It was not a big deal, but that's that. Because the Americans were so keen to get India on board for the Indo-US nuclear civilian deal. And there should be appreciation in Indian circles about this aspect, which is not. It is something to bear in mind. And when I mentioned about Iran playing havoc in the region, it is something to bear in mind too, ladies and gentlemen. Remember when Iranian Revolutionary Guards go on record boasting on Lebanese television, today we control 4 Arab capitals, what are they referring to? Baghdad, Sana'a, Beirut, and Damascus. Damascus, as you know, with the Syrian civil war, where Putin's Russia and Iran are the only ones who've supported the Assad regime, despite the entire Muslim world being against Assad and the global community at large, is one thing. Sana'a, of course, I'm referring to the Yemeni civil war, because Saudi Arabia feels that that is its sphere of influence on its southern flank, and Iran has no business to interfere there. But Iran is by supporting the Houthi Shia rebels, and Iran feels it can pay back Saudi Arabia on that. And they have their own regional rivalry, which goes back for decades. Beirut, of course, with the Hezbollah factor, who are Shia, as you know, and play havoc with Lebanese politics by making and unbreaking governments. And finally, Baghdad. The 8-year bloody conflict that I referred to between Iran and Iraq was the bloodiest, and Iran lost about 1 million Iranians in that war. And after that war, Dr. Gore, the one takeaway lesson for Iran was, we will never have a Western soft flank on our border. And we need to have, and this is going to sound familiar to many of you, strategic depth in Iraq. Yes, that sounds familiar. Pakistan to Afghanistan. That we can never have a strong Afghanistan or a strong Iraq, which would ever threaten us. We must have a pliant regime in place, which will do our bidding, something of a vassal state, and can never be a threat to us again. Of course, in the Iraq factor, I refer to the war. Iraq is predominantly Shia too. Saddam was a Sunni minority dictator, and the Sunnis are a minority there, then and now. And of course, with Pakistan and Afghanistan, as you know, is because of the Durin line and the Pashtunistan factor, and that the Afghans since 1947 had irredentist claims on Peshawar and the NWFP province, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, claiming that it was just an aspect of British colonialism and that it ought to be returned to Afghanistan, which is, of course, really the reason for Pak-Afghan relations being festering over the decades. And they have been festering for the last 75 years due to this. This is the primary reason. Which is why Pakistan has always felt and has been wary of Afghanistan, to keep it in check as such. Iran finds the need to do exactly that. Please note, it seeks strategic depth in having a planned regime in Iraq. That brings us to the fact that Iran has not created problems for India, but of course, as you know, the attack on the Israeli diplomat's wife in New Delhi with that car bomb incident some years ago, and she was very seriously injured. And that attack was going to take place on the same day as a massive attack on the Israeli embassy in Bangkok. That was aborted, but the one in New Delhi did take place, and it can be traced back to the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. And of course, India found itself in a tight spot on that aspect. Like I mentioned, these things have been discussed behind doors, and I do not have much on it. Maybe some of you can fill me on it in our discussion. I'm not privy to what has happened between India and Iran, but surely there must have been discussions of a very strong nature taken up by the Indian administration, because that brings me to India's burgeoning and very strong relationship with Israel, particularly after diplomatic relations were fully established in 1992. Diplomatic relations were established in 1953 when a consulate opened in Bombay, but they remained low-key for all those decades, given the Muslim factor, the Arab factor, and India's non-aligned status and its commitment to anti-colonialism and the like. But of course, the Muslim lobby factor played a lot into it, which is why India was, quite cool and ambivalent towards the Jewish Republic. But after 1992, Indo-Israeli relations have never looked back. Israel is a principal supplier of defense equipment to India, as you know. And there is, when I mentioned about the naval technicians and India providing upgrade maintenance to Iran for its artillery guns and some of its own Russian equipment, which Iran incidentally possesses, like the T-27 tanks, or talk of India selling Conquer's anti-missile guided weapons systems and spare parts. The Israelis have brought that up, like the Americans, that we do need some firm commitment from you, that is New Delhi, that some of this technology will not be passed to the Iranians. We do need something very firm from you on that, not just a oral commitment like, no, we won't let it happen, but, at no point can there be any technology transfer of the sort, or that the Iranians can wangle it from you as such. Israel appreciates that India has had a relationship with Iran. It doesn't object to that. And Iran tacitly accepts. It doesn't like it, obviously. I mean, this is a country which is not just dead set against Israel, but wants to call for its annihilation. When President Ahmadinejad hosts Holocaust-denying conferences in Tehran, which he has, Holocaust cartoon competitions, which is in sheer poor taste, to say nothing of anti-Semitism, which is officially advocated and is part of the Islamic Republic's rhetoric. There's nothing much to grace the occasion by discussing it, but this is a man who on record has said that the Jerusalem regime must be wiped from the page of time, from the arena of time. In Persian, I'm quoting from the original. That obviously gives jitters to Israelis, because even the Arabs don't talk about like this anymore. And given the marked improvement in relations, particularly after the Abraham Accords under President Trump, now, there are air flights between Bahrain and the UAE and Tel Aviv, for example, as you know. Gulf Air flies to Tel Aviv from Bahrain, El Al flies to Dubai, and ladies and gentlemen, Air India flies Delhi to Tel Aviv, and it passes through Saudi airspace, and Riyadh allowed that in a symbolic gesture by not banning flights. At some point, you have to pass. There's no other option. But the New Delhi Tel Aviv Air India flight does go through Saudi airspace and a bit of Jordan and all, and none of the Arabs object to it. So the Israel factor looms in the room as for Indo-Iranian ties. But To come towards my conclusion before we open up the discussion, what are the prospects for Indo-Iranian ties? Well, one point of convergence and shared interest is Afghanistan and stability. The second would be connectivity. That is to say, with the North-South corridor, which was instituted in 2000, Bombay, Bandar Abbas, Baku, Astrakhan, St. Petersburg. Not much has happened with that. It's been purely symbolic for a host of reasons. And now, of course, the Ukraine war and the Armenia-Azerbaijan war raging too. So the auguries don't look particularly good for that. Connectivity is a factor with Iran. Hydrocarbons has always been a part of the relationship. Defense is something to be seen, and there has been some defense cooperation. But of course, coming back to Afghanistan and regional stability, which is in both India and Iran's interests as such. Thank you very much. Over to you, Dr. Kaur.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this is the most authentic exposition of India-Iran relations from various perspectives. You have touched upon how Afghanistan, Pakistan, Israel, US, even China have impacted these relationships, and from history to the present times. It has been a wonderful journey. And you have, I think, put it like an encyclopedia, I think, right from the beginning to the present times. And it leaves no room for questions. But even then, I will ask my students, they must be having some queries, and they will put their queries to you. Yes, now I open the house for questions, and let the students introduce themselves first and then ask questions. Come on, be quick.
Good evening, sir. Sir, I am Riya Sharma, and currently I am pursuing my master's in political science. Sir, today we are witnessing an era of like-minded and issue-based partnerships. And sir, India's partners don't seem to get along well with Iran, as as India and US relations are becoming stronger. US and Iran ties are declining, and as India is warming up with the Saudis, Iranians and Arabs are becoming more intolerant of each other. Also, sir, Iran's partnership with China doesn't seem to go in India's interest. So, sir, don't you think that the partnerships established by both the countries are hampering their own bilateral ties?
Yeah, well, bilateral ties will be hampered. You're absolutely right to say that, because of other factors in the room. I mean, how many balls can you juggle at one time as an acrobat? And that is what diplomacy does come down to. You please someone, you displease someone else. But it's the act of, as they say, the definition of politics is the art of the possible. You mentioned about Iran-China ties. Dr. Kaur, the Sino-Iranian 25-year agreement that has been so much touted in the press, and then, of course, there was all this talk in the New York Times, much to American alarm, that it's going to be $400 to $500 million that the Chinese are going to invest the new BRI in Iran. Well, let me assuage and point out to everyone, it's practically hot air. And I'll tell you why. Foreign Minister Wang signed that with Javad Zarif in Tehran during lockdown in March, a few days after Nowruz, the Iranian New Year, in March 2021 last year. It is, for all purposes and intents, and this is important, please, ladies and gentlemen, it's a non-binding document. Dr. Kaur, just as the directive principles of state policy in the Indian Constitution are non-enforceable, they are non-justiciable, if you remember your civics from school days. The clauses in the Sino-Iranian agreement are non-enforceable. They are merely encouraging exhortatory quotative points that we shall do this in the future, we shall endeavor to do that, just as joint declarations and MOUs tend to be. What you act upon happens later. No figures or sums were provided from the Iranian Foreign Ministry, neither the Chinese. Both sides were non-committal. It was a symbolic gesture to thumb their nose at the Americans and the West to show that we can still do business with each other. and that like I said, to boo the Americans that this is not a unipolar world, and we have China to look to. Just as the Pakistanis say that China hai hamara sort of thing. Of course, the Chinese do put in a lot for the Pakistanis, substantially speaking, resources, but here nothing has been committed. Not a bit at all in terms of sheer figures. And in fact, Dr. Kaur, when it was brought up by the spokesman of the Iranian Foreign Ministry as to why has this so-called treaty not been published in Iranian newspapers and elsewhere, the Foreign Office spokesman in Tehran said, for the simple reason that it's not a binding document. Binding document with financial sums and figures committed have to be published in the public domain. One is obliged to do so. This is a non-binding document. This was just a treaty of understanding, so we have no reason to publish it. Moreover, Dr. Kaur, in the Iranian diaspora in the US, Australia, and elsewhere, there was talk of Iran being sold out. It's going to become a stooge or an East India company and that sort of thing to Pakistan. Jawad Zarif, Foreign Minister Zarif, was forced to go on record. Not an inch of Iranian soil will be given to China for bases or the like. We will never compromise on any of this. That is completely non-negotiable. It's not going to happen. So any such voices are mere rumor-mongering voices. And we put it in Persian, which I translate in English, not a handspan of Iranian soil will be allotted or even let to the Chinese on a temporary basis. So I wouldn't set much store by the Sino-Iranian agreement. But the Chinese have, after the 2009 Green Movement, supplied Chinese intelligence and the Chinese deep state have supplied Iranian security forces with deep packet information technology, which allows Iran to block websites. And you see these youth unrest demonstrations happening since September, and Iranians from typing on keyboards to obtain blocked websites, and also that Iranian security forces can find out who's typing what on websites. The Chinese have sent, because this kind of security is shared in Xinjiang to repress the Uyghurs, and the Chinese have shared. This is not much known publicly, but we do know that there has been Sino-Iranian intelligence cooperation between security forces and Iranian intelligence on this aspect to repress their population. No question about it. Yes, please. Next one.
Any other question?
Yes, sir. If time allows, may I ask one more question?
Sure. And
Yeah.
then Dr. Ghosh after Ms. Sharma.
Yes. So it is said that had India been swift with the Farzadbi gas pipeline project and the Zahedan railway project, Iran wouldn't have drifted towards Chinese capitals for their completion. So, sir, can we say that there is some sort of lack of political will from India's side? And can we now pin our hopes to the Chabahar project, or there's a possibility it may slip away from our hand, just like Farzadbi and Zahedan?
Well, Fardan's gone, as you know, and ONGC is sitting there twiddling its thumbs. And of course, yes, the Iranian contention or complaint was, where's the money? Where's the dosh? Show me the cash. And of course, the Indians were reluctant, I think for a variety of reasons, but partly they were slow because things just move slowly in New Delhi, I suppose, but partly with this looming of sanctions that made them very jittery to undertake more investment than necessary. And then, of course, after 2016 and Modi's May visit, of course, there has been an upswing with relations personally with Trump and with Biden. And don't forget India's inclusion now in the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue with Canberra and Tokyo, that India needs to take in these Western interests. And that may not go down well in dealing with a, quite frankly, a reprehensible regime like Iran, which kills its own population and spreads murder and mayhem in its near abroad region. That a democracy at age 75, and this is India at 75 to 2022 that we're talking about, to be too closely consorting with a regime of this sort. So yes, but the cash bit is right, Ms. Sharma. It was the Iranians say, where was the dosh? You never paid up, so obviously we went to someone else. But I don't think I think Chabahar will just stutter along. It may not quite slip out of Indian hands as such, because there have been waivers allotted to it. The Americans have been gracious enough to give Chabahar a waiver. They do understand, and of course they would understand because they do know the Chinese factor with Gwadar. So they are willing to let India have a sphere of influence in Chabahar as such. Yes, Dr. Ghosh, the other lady who wanted to say something.
Yeah,
Yeah,
good evening, sir. First of all, it's an honor and a privilege to hear you. Now, my question to you is energy security, energy cooperation is a very important factor of cooperation between India, Pakistan, and Iran. Now, in the natural gas pipeline, where the agreement took place in 1990, Iran has already completed 1100 kilometers of its stated area.
Yes, yes.
But
Ahmadinejad
Pakistan
also
has,
did so. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, but Pakistan has displayed over the years inertia regarding the 780 kilometers proposed area pipeline, which saying that it is under US pressure. So, what is the future you
Yeah.
see in this
Yes, Dr. Ghosh, very
pipeline
quickly.
project?
Yes, yes. Dr. Ghosh, it's not happening anytime soon for two very good reasons. The Pakistanis are still on the drawing board. Nawaz Sharif's flip-flops on again, off again, hoga, nahi hoga, karega, nahi karega sort of thing. And the Iranians for their part are asking, well, have you moved beyond the drawing board? We are still looking at charts and plans and projects. And add to that, the Islamabad-based STPI, Sustainable Development Policy Institute, came out with a stinging report. And the STPI is a very, very respectable think tank. I would read anything that the STPI publishes if I were you. They undertook an excellent report some years ago on the subtle subversion. That was the title of the report, of how horrible the Pakistani school curriculum is in referring to Hindus with opprobrium, and that this was the SDPI, Dr. Ghosh, and that it is absolutely uncalled for such inflammatory language and tasteless language against our minorities, as Hindus and Christians, and glorifying jihad in the school books and the like. The SDPI did that report, and it's a very respectable think tank. They came out on the track on this pipeline business. They said in just 2 words, this pipeline is a death sentence for Pakistan. If Pakistan were to pursue it, given the Iranians have jacked up these artificial rates, and the rates that we'll be paying for rentals to Iran for the supply of gas would be more than what we domestically pay for gas. So the Iranians are trying to hoodwink everyone with that. And to say nothing of the fact that the gas pipeline is passing through restive Balochistan, which is an open revolt against the Pakistani state. What about sabotage and security? The Indians could not count upon uninterrupted flows from the Pakistan side. How else are we going to get the gas? And then, of course, there were the pricing problems, which is why India quite rightly got out when the going was good, and so pulled out of it. The matter remains a dead issue, and long may it remain so, because this gas line is a waste of everyone's time insofar as I'm personally concerned. And there's no need to jeopardize our relations with America on this. And quite rightly, Americans were wary of it, and they proved right. Now, whether you like to take a Western point is not the factor. The Balochistan element is there. Who's going to guarantee with secessionists, and what is going to happen to your gas supplies? And then when the Pakistanis themselves came out with this report, which they said that the price is a death sentence on Pakistan. I mean, who are you to? Who's anyone to complain against these two compelling factors? The Iran may have completed the gas pipeline because it's desperate for exports, but clearly the Pakistanis couldn't do much of it because they were incompetent. But the Indians were wary of it and quite rightly pulled out of it officially at some point. And I'm glad that they did. It was a very wise decision on India's part.
Thank you so much.
let me add one thing more. Dr. Meenakshi Ghosh lives in Mumbai.
Right.
And when you come next, I think now you are in a hurry to go back tomorrow. Whenever you come next, please let us know. She would like to have an interaction with you.
Sure.
She's an expert on African affairs. And our next issue is
So
going to
not
be
only
on
Africa, but Indian Ocean also.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
very useful, Dr. Ghosh, because of the Indo-Pacific Quarter aspect. I'm working on that now a bit also, with Indian Ocean region, sea lines and communication, which will become very important, which fits in with the Royal Navy's Look East policy, as
So
you know.
I was very much impressed because recently I worked closely with I worked closely with a project on China and the Asian coast of South Asia. So
Right.
it was almost a dream come true and very important in today's strategic scenario.
I'm very glad to hear of it. Thank you. Thank you for letting me know.
So, any other question? Otherwise, I have few queries which I think we will expect you to clarify. Yeah, India is in a very pitiable situation that all our bilateral ties with the countries are impacted by major powers. US, they want us not to buy oil from Iran. Now they say that don't buy oil from Russia. So how long India could be dictated by major powers like this?
Well, Dr. Go, long and the short of that to answer is you can dictate to India till kingdom come, but then India goes and does what it wants on its own. India's always done that because it's conducted itself with India's pursuit of philosophy is just a ruthless transactionalism, strategic autonomy, and it just does what it wants at some point. And these other countries do factor that in. Now, just to take the Ukraine crisis, and that's an important point. I mean, defense supplies from the Russians have been decreasing over the years as India turns to better equipment from the Americans or the Israelis and elsewhere. But even the Biden administration said, as you noticed at the Quad Summit, that yes, we do understand there are historical reasons for India's compulsion and being tied to supplies with Moscow. They do factor that in, despite India being a Quad member, sort of thing. That you can't overnight expect India to just walk away from spare parts and the like. It's a relationship which has built up over decades. So one must give credit also to the Westerners, particularly the Americans, who have time and time again, factored in that, especially on the defense bit, that India just simply can't walk away, given with a raging border war with China since 2017, as you know. They do factor that in, and they tend to, play it down. Please note on this point, Turkey, which is a NATO ally, was slapped sanctions for those S-200 warhead missiles for purchase from Moscow. India has also purchased those missiles, Dr. Gore, but India was not sanctioned by Washington. CATSA sanctions were applied against Ankara, but not on New Delhi. If you were a Turk, you'd be screaming that we are a NATO ally and you can do this to us, and India's not even a NATO ally, and you let them get away with it without even a rap on the knuckle, for example, Dr. Ghosh. But Biden went out of his way and the Americans went out and they said, no, we have to factor in India's requirements. There's a war raging with China. We simply have to accommodate them. So, these are these aspects which don't come out in the Indian context, where there should be a little bit of appreciation of what Washington does. And it's not just consistently a hegemon which is breathing down your neck. I don't feel Indians are sometimes fair to the Americans on these aspects. And for example, with the Chinese border standoff since 2017, did you know that they have been supplying us with drones? The Indian army has been supplied with drones, and it is Washington which has been making very, very loud noises against Xi Jinping on the border, and it is the Indian Foreign Office telling the State Department to cool it. Yes, Indians telling the Americans, don't provoke the Chinese and say too much against them in our behalf or on our behalf to support us, because we just want to keep it lying low. And this has been reported, that the Indians are requesting the Americans take our side, but don't speak too loudly about it. And the Americans are taking our side, and they've been speaking for India. Please remember that too. Moscow has not spoken. And let me tell you, even before the Ukraine war, Dr. Gore, Putin has been much more critical of India joining the Quad than even Xi Jinping. Putin has been making the most noises about India joining the Quad. Xi Jinping made some noises, and the Chinese did, but they let it pass. But Russia has been extremely voluble on India joining the Quad. And speaking of Russia, do Indians care to note that Dosti Druzhba military exercises have been taking place? Russo Pak joint army military exercises take place as a matter of protocol annually, or I believe it's annually as such. That has been happening too. So something to Indians should note that Russia is not just your be all or end all. Russia conducts military transactions with India, but it's happy to have military exercises with Pakistan. Let me point that out too.
Yes, that should be a balanced viewpoint on the subject. Lastly, of course, you have explained things in the journal. I would like to more know about how this I2U2, how it has impacted or is going to impact India-Iran relations.
Well, it affects in the sense because that Iranian bit rushed of the railway line near the Rush section has not been built, although the Russians have promised funding for it. I mean, you literally have to lay the tracks for it. That has not happened. The tracks which would join from the branch from the Armenian side, what about it? I mean, Armenia and Azerbaijan are in the middle of a war. And also, please note, Dr. Kaur, Central Asia is going to be affected because Russian ultra-nationalists, and please note this, I don't know if it's well known in India, they are again itching for a fight. Just not as in Ukraine, they are itching for a fight in northern Kyrgyzstan, northern Kazakhstan, I beg your pardon. Russian ultra-nationalists. So you can imagine how that's going to pan out with Putin's supremacist notions and meddling in Central Asia. The Tajiks and the Kyrgyz had a border war, even as the Shanghai Economic Summit Cooperation Summit was going on in September 2022, when Modi was in Samarkand, as you know. So all of these factors are going to impinge on the North-South corridor. Iran is plunged in chaos in near civil war-like conditions, and the situation is going to get even far worse than that. And you need, and the rail line is not being linked to Charbar. Of course, Charbar doesn't come because in the North-South corridor, Bandar Abbas is involved. But I mean, you would expect goods to come from St. Petersburg to Bombay, New Bombay Port, Bashi, but there have just been trial symbolic pilot runs. It is not a full-fledged running corridor as such, much as it was wanted when it was first proposed. It has potential and promise, but looking at the global security scenario with all these aspects playing out and the havoc that is in all these respective countries, it is not going to be in India's interest in the medium or short-term future, surely. Particularly now, what is happening with Kazakhstan too, as I mentioned. Northern Kazakhstan, Russian secessionists are fighting with Kazakh security forces. And like I mentioned, Tajik and Kyrgyz border spats happening as such.
So thank you very much for a very lengthy discussion, and you have explained everything right from the beginning to the present scenario and made things very clear. There are certain, miscalculations, misunderstandings between the
And missed
two
opportunities.
countries.
That's always there in foreign policy.
Exactly. But they have to got clarified through these discussions like this. And I'm really thankful to you that during your short visit to Mumbai, you have taken time to address us and clarify many things. And that's why I call you the encyclopedia of Iran. I mean, what you have done, I know. I've read all about your writings and all that. And previously also you had contributed an article for FPRC Journal. So that shows how deeply engrossed you are in the studies on Iran. So thank you very much. We hope to have further, opportunities to have your views on certain issues concerning the bilateral relations. And I tell you one thing on a personal note, that the Iran embassy is the only place where I visit on National Day celebrations. And they have been so, lovely people. I mean, when I talk to them, they're very, very cordial and all that. So with that note, with your permission, I would like to close this session and hope to have future, conversations with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Go. All the best. Goodbye.
Thank you.